Electrification, electric vehicles, and decarbonization. What are the opportunities and what does the future hold? Welcome to today's webinar and the Nordic launch of Bloomberg's new energy finance electric vehicle outlook. My name is Mira Bhatia and I'm from Statkraft, and it is a pleasure to introduce our speakers and panelists today, and my co-moderator Marius Holm, who's the CEO of environmental organization Zero.
Yes, thank you, Mira. Zero and Statkraft has been working together for a long time, first on increasing clean energy production, but lately more and more on the second phase of decarbonization, which is utilizing that electricity to replace fossil fuels throughout the economy.
And with us today in the Oslo studio here, we have Norway's Minister of Petroleum and Energy, Tina Bru. Welcome. We have the Norwegian MP and member of the Finance Committee, Kari Elisabeth Kaski. Welcome. And Statkraft CEO, Christian Nøringen Tønnesen. In London, we have Sepp Hanbest, Chief Economist of the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and the lead author of the New Energy Outlook, as well as Colin McCarricher, who's the Global Head of Advanced Transport and who will be presenting the electric vehicle outlook for us today. The outlook will go through how road transport will evolve over the next 20 years and what might have been the short-term impact from COVID-19 on global auto sales. Sepp will also give us an indication of energy markets right now and what the future holds. But I would like to now also tell you as an audience, you're welcome to ask questions at any time, and there is a chat just at the bottom of your screen where you can post your questions, which we will, at the end of the session, post to our panelists. But first of all, I will give the word to Tina Bru. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this important webinar. I am looking very forward to the presentation of the Bloomberg's Electric Vehicle Outlook and the new important perspectives it will give us all. Electrification is an important measure in several sectors to cut emissions, especially here in Norway, because we have developed substantial renewable resources through our hydropower. And this gives us a very unique starting point for an electrification across the board. Our ability to create wealth from our renewable resources has brought us prosperity. In Norway, our industrial revolution was built on renewable hydropower. And today, a number of onshore wind power projects are being built as well. More renewable energy is essential for meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. Norway has an ambitious climate policy. We have an agreement with the EU where we are going to cut at least 40% of our emissions by 2030. And this winter, we increased Norway's target under the Paris Agreement, up to at least 50% and aiming for a target of 55% emission cuts. In the European Green Deal, the European Commission has signaled that they will present a plan for increasing the EU's target as well. I support this. Energy and climate are closely connected. However, we must recognize that the countries of the world have very different starting points. Norway's energy and climate policies are aimed at utilizing our advantages within renewable resources. We provide a framework for profitable production of renewable energy. We are developing and expanding the power grid, and we are using our renewable resources for new purposes, such as a substitute for fossil energy. And as one of the few countries in the world, Norway has a surplus of renewable power. This is expected to continue as long as we ensure that new power resources are built in the years ahead. And because of our flexible hydropower and the wind power, supported by an efficient grid, our electricity supply is almost 100% renewable. Many wind farms are currently under construction in Norway. In the years to come, more will probably be built. But as in other countries, this is not without controversy. The government needs to make sure that our renewable resources contribute to sustainable wealth creation. And the government will soon present a white paper on onshore wind power to Parliament. Here, we will address the need to provide an improved framework for wind power concessions. We're looking at environmental concerns, how to secure a better local process, and ensuring that the lead time from start to finish for such projects are shortened considerably. But looking back through our history, Norway's renewable resources have been a blessing for development and progress. Looking ahead, they will also put us in the forefront of the global energy transition. When it comes to electrification of transportation, we are far ahead of most countries, especially when it comes to passenger vehicles. According to the Electric Vehicle Outlook, 53% of new passenger vehicle sales in Norway in 2019 were electric. And as a member of the Norwegian Parliament, I participated in the efforts leading to the current governmental goal stating that all new passenger vehicles sold in 2025 must be non-emitting vehicles. I am very proud of this ambition, and my role as the Minister of Petroleum and Energy gives me the opportunity to work on the energy side of this ambition. And I am also proud to see how electrification of transport creates new opportunities for our export industries, contributing to energy transition in other countries. One example is the Norwegian company Zaptec, exporting advanced charging systems for electric vehicles. And while pursuing our ambitions for electrification, we must keep in mind the underlying foundation for this transition: a renewable and efficient electricity system and a well-developed and strong grid. We see the potential for further electrification. In the report Klimakur, our technical agencies have looked at many new measures for electrification, for instance, in the transportation sector and within industry. We are also looking at the potential for further electrification of the largest industrial plants onshore, as well as further electrification of offshore installations. It is my responsibility to facilitate this development. But we should also keep in mind that not all energy use can or should be electrified. Other solutions like hydrogen may also prevail in the future. And the pandemic has hit our economy, as many other countries, hard. And we need to get the economy out of this slump, and we need to create new jobs. The government sees a chance for businesses to create green jobs within a more sustainable future. Therefore, the government has proposed a 3.6 billion Norwegian krone for a green restructuring package. And I'll conclude there. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking very much forward to hearing more about your new report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now some opening remarks by you, Christian.
Statkraft, as Europe's largest producer of renewable energy and based in a country that is run on renewable electricity, believe that the global energy transition and the focus on climate progress is key. This is even more important now as the world finds itself in a global economic downturn as a result of the unforeseen COVID-19 pandemic. Before the coronavirus crisis, we were on a positive track, with renewable energy capacity hitting record levels last year in 2019, and solid efforts towards a low emission and electrified society was about to take place. Today, in Statkraft, we strongly believe that this development needs to continue. We need to create opportunities for the broader economy, for the industry, and for society at large. We see that electrification of virtually everything holds promise, drastically lowering emissions, and with a decline in the cost of electric batteries, 100% electric vehicle world and a majority of electrically heated homes would have significant impact on reducing the world's CO2 emissions. Electrification can cut emissions in transport, building and industry in Europe by around 60% by mid-century. And in a recent Bloomberg NEF report made together with Statkraft and Eaton, that was highlighted. We embrace the bold belief that it is possible for renewable energy to comprise 80% of the world's electricity production by 2050. And in Europe, this percentage can reach 90% renewable also by 2050. To further show Statkraft's commitment to accelerating the transition to electric vehicles and making electric transport the new normal by 2030. I'm happy to announce today that Statkraft has signed up to the climate group's electric vehicles initiative EV100. That is an agreement to transform business fleets to all electric, and we are the first Norwegian company to sign this agreement. The move towards a renewable sourced and electrified society will take strong incentives from our governments, a clear direction from global industrial leaders, and widespread collaboration among multiple players. That goes all the way from the oil and gas industry to renewable companies like Statkraft.
Thank you, Christian. Now, Kari Elisabeth, you have a history of being a climate activist before you entered Parliament for the Social Left Party. And now listening to a Minister of Petroleum from the Conservative Party and a CEO from a major company in Norway, both praising electrification of the transport sector and the very ambitious target of having 100% electric vehicle sales in 2025. Are we all good then?
Well, in a way, I'm optimistic at the brink of this decade that we're entering now. But obviously, we're in an economic crisis at the moment, and we need to make sure that the recovery packages that we are getting through Parliament now are green packages, because if they're not really a recovery for the Norwegian economy. And I'm a bit concerned, and I try to say everywhere I go that 50% of the energy that we still use in Norway is fossil. So we need to make sure that we both build more renewable energy and also fast forward the electrification that we need in every sector in Norway.
Did you have any other reflections yourself on what was said by Christian and
well, you
Tina Bru?
know, the ambition is 100% electric vehicle sales, but you know, we need policy incentives to make that happen. We have incentives in place, but they're nowhere strong enough to reach the target, not for cars, but especially not for vans, which is a fast-growing sector when everybody gets their goods delivered by the door, especially now in the corona crisis. There's a lot of diesel vans moving around in cities around the world.
Fair reflection. I would now like to hand over the word to Seb in London, who actually was here, I think it was exactly a year ago, where he was standing with you, Christian, in Oslo City Hall and was presenting Bloomberg New Energy Finance's New Energy Outlook then. The world has changed quite a bit. As you all mentioned, we're going through a global economic downturn. We have been hit by the pandemic. It would be now very interesting to hear from Seb what your view is on the energy markets right now and the role in renewable energy will play going forward. If you could give us some viewpoints on your short, medium-term and long-term outlook.
Hi, good afternoon, and it is a great pleasure to once again be able to join Statkraft and the community to talk about the future of energy. And I think the question of what's changed since last year is a big one. 2020 has certainly, I think, set the bar for a tumultuous year. And this time last year, we were talking about the New Energy Outlook. That's due out in October this year. We're expanding its scope to cover the whole energy and emissions economy. As we do that, we're wrestling with this question of how might this tumultuous year play out into the medium and long term? How might it affect the low carbon transition that we're tracking? And we started that work by thinking about the impact today on the economy. And we've now got, I think, 13 or 14 indicator reports looking at everything from oil and gas to sustainability investment through to stimulus packages and metals and materials industries. And underpinning all that sector by sector analysis is this dramatic decline in economic activity. And I think at the heart of the answer to the question of how the world may look different into the medium to long term as a result of the present moment is a question about how we return from this crisis. And that's a very big question, and it's not clear that we have the answer yet. We're still early days, and while it feels a little like things are returning to normal, I suspect this journey is far from over. we've certainly seen the economic decline translate into a reduction in electricity demand, between 15 and 20% from expectations around Q2 for parts of Western Europe. Not universally down. I think in Scandinavia in general, the electricity demand has been consistent with expectations, even a little higher. In Australia, a little higher. But overall, for Europe at least, nuclear power is down, gas is down, coal is down. And in many ways, if you think about the oversupplied oil market, where we saw the US benchmark drop to a depth of $40 a barrel last month, and that cheap oil, the warmer winter, and weak power demand, robust carbon prices, and it's a bit of a perfect storm for coal-fired power. We're starting to see a pretty miserable economic.
You're breaking up a bit, Seb, so I think we're hoping that the connection will get better. We're sort of intermittently hearing you at the moment, but we will make sure that this gets picked up again. But sorry, finish off your last thought.
Hopefully you can hear me. I'm sorry about the technology. I'd love to be in Oslo and doing this in person, of course. But overall, this big question, and I'll leave it at this, is how does the current moment translate? And if it's a long drawn-out recession, I think we'll find very much that some of the things that have occurred, and the changes in behavior and the changes in outlook, will have a major impact on not just electricity demand, but also on greenhouse gas emissions, which may change the journey from here into the future. So what I leave it there, hopefully we've heard some of that, and I'll let us move on with the program.
Thank you so much, Seb. I think we will fix a few things on our side, so I hope the audience on the web has been following this closely and has heard it clearly and well. We would now like to hand over to Colin in London, who will give us actually now the presentation of the Electric Vehicle Outlook report by Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
Thanks, and thank you everybody for joining us. I wish I could be there in person. I know how nice Oslo is at this time of year with those warm, sunny evenings that stretch on and on and on. Unfortunately, this will have to do for now. What I'm going to do today is talk through the findings from our electric vehicle outlook. And just to kind of give some background on what our electric vehicle outlook is, this is our actual outlook for all of road transport. Despite the name, it looks at everything to do with road transport. We're looking at all the different segments, and then we're also looking at the mega trends that are impacting those segments. So things like electrification, shared mobility, autonomous driving, urbanization, and then mapping those onto what does that mean for the automotive sector? What does it mean for oil markets? What does it mean for electricity markets? What does it mean for infrastructure, battery metals, emissions, all these sorts of things? So we draw together all of our experts from around the world, and we try and figure out what we think is going to happen over the next little while. And that's what I'm going to talk through today, is 10 findings from that report. And I won't try and talk through everything in that. There's a lot of information, and we're always happy to discuss it with anybody if you have any follow-up questions. But what I'll do today is just talk through these 10 main findings. So the first one is around COVID-19. Obviously, we spent a lot of time this year trying to understand what the impacts of COVID-19 will be. And one of the conclusions from that is that we think electric vehicles will hold up significantly better than combustion vehicles and rebound faster. So we do think EV sales are going to drop this year, but we think overall they're going to drop less than the overall market, and then less than internal combustion engine vehicles, and come back faster. And if you look at the first quarter of the year, you can start to see this pattern emerging, particularly in Europe, where EV sales are holding up much better than the overall market. And in Europe especially, you have the impact of European automotive CO2 regulations coming in this year, and automakers were probably pushing some of their orders that they could have fulfilled in 2019 into 2020 to avoid paying fines for if they missed those CO2 targets. And then you also have a bit of a backlog of orders for some of the big flagship models that have launched recently. And that means the purchase decision for these vehicles was actually made earlier, prior to the pandemic hitting. China, one notable exception, and that's partially because last year was particularly strong in the first quarter and the first half of the year for EV sales, because there was a subsidy cut coming in June. But we think that'll start to normalize, and we think the Chinese EV market will probably start to return to growth again in the second half of the year. But so overall, we think EV sales are going to hold up better than combustion vehicle sales through 2020. We are forecasting about 1.7 million EVs sold this year, and then seeing that rise really quickly again after that to just over about 5 million by 2023. That corresponds to about 7% of the global auto market. Now, you see most of those are battery electrics, but plug-in hybrids also playing a role, particularly in areas where fuel economy regulations are quite stringent and automakers have to sell a lot of those in order to hit their targets. But of course, there's some really big open questions with COVID, and there are many we could go into. I'll highlight a few here. One of them is around stimulus. So what sort of priorities are governments going to push with their stimulus measures? It looks like in Europe, and to a lesser extent in China so far from what we've seen, clean vehicles are going to be a big part of that. Consumer attitudes, will this push more people into private car ownership and usage and out of buses and things like, and other forms of public transit? What will automakers do? What will they prioritize? And lastly, around clean air in cities. And there's two angles to this. One of them is that we've seen how nice cities can be when there is less air pollution. But there's another one around health impacts, and it looks like the health impacts from COVID are worse in areas with worse air quality and with more respiratory problems. So just to highlight this, I took this photo just a couple weeks ago at the height of the lockdown in London, and it's certainly just a very different London skyline than I've ever seen in 10 years of living here. And very, very, very clear, very quiet, a very different city than I'm used to, and I have to say, it was quite pleasant. So there is some impact there in people's mentality, hopefully not just my own. So that's our first finding from this year. The second one is around tipping points. So when we build our model for EV adoption, and we do it by different segment, but on the passenger vehicle segment, we think there's two really big ones. They are essentially price parity. So when do EVs get fully cost competitive with their internal combustion engine counterparts? And something we call infrastructure slowdown. So by the mid-2020s, we think in most segments, in most large auto markets, EVs will be fully cost competitive on an upfront basis without subsidies. There is a lot of variation though. Some segments don't get there because of very low average purchase prices don't get there until the late 2020s or even till around 2030. And then around infrastructure, we think that people who have access to home or workplace charging go electric faster, significantly faster than those who live in high-rise apartment buildings with no access to charging infrastructure at home. And what that means is that the adoption goes really quickly from parity and then starts to slow down a little bit in the mid-2030s as you've already diffused through all those people who have easy access to charging infrastructure. And that's what that looks like in the model. So a big rise quickly from 2025 onwards, and then it slows down a bit from the mid-2030s, most of those being battery electric. We don't see a route for plug-in hybrids to be fully cost competitive because they still have an internal combustion engine on board, so you sort of have two technologies. Fuel cell vehicles playing a very minor role. Even that role that you see there of getting to just below 1% of the fleet actually in 2040 requires a 1,000-fold scale up from where we are today. So even with that very, very aggressive growth in the size of the fuel cell vehicle fleet, it doesn't play a significant role. But what that looks like for passenger vehicles is around 58% of sales by 2040 and around a third of the fleet. Now, one of the interesting lessons here is actually from the Nordics. So this is Norwegian passenger EV sales. And I think there's two big lessons from this. One of them is that it goes slow until it goes fast. So it took a long time for Norway to get to sort of 10%. And then a relatively short time to go from 10 to over 50%. But the other lesson, I think, is a really important one, and it's a simple one as well, and it's that economics matter. So what Norway has showed us is that when EVs are cost competitive, and to some degree they're artificially cost competitive because of the tax structure and incentives in Norway, people buy them in large number. And that sounds obvious, but it wasn't obvious until Norway really proved it. And I think that's a huge contribution to other policymakers around the world confirming that, yeah, probably the most important thing is economics. And it doesn't mean that every government will follow the exact same policy path as Norway does. That's probably expensive for some governments. But it does mean that once we get to cost competitive EVs, we will probably see the sales rise really quickly. And that is a really important message and a really important contribution that Norway and the Nordics have made towards understanding how fast the world can go electric. So another one of the findings is around China and Europe. So we think China and Europe are going to pull ahead of the US. So really China and Europe leading the global EV market, accounting for around 72% of all global EV sales in 2030. Now, when we made this was back in March and April. And then since then, of course, in the last few weeks, there have been all these stimulus measures aimed at cleaner cars. So actually our European share is probably going to push up in the next little while as those stimulus measures work their way through. And particularly in Europe, what's really driving that is CO2 regulations for autos. So that dashed line is where the regulations are going, 2020, 2021, 2025, 2030. And the blue line is historical emissions. So you can see those have to come down a lot. You really can't meet that without a lot of plug-in cars in the mix. That is our estimate of how many plug-in cars you need as a percentage of sales. So the blue line is if you do it all with battery electrics. The purple line is if it's all plug-in hybrids. Realistically, it'll be somewhere in between those two. But you need a really sharp increase in these big compliance target years where it gets more stringent to keep hitting that. And you probably need somewhere a third to a half of sales to have a plug by 2030 to hit the CO2 targets. So Europe and China pull ahead, but actually the US catches up. So the US catches up in the 2030s. And that's because there are a huge number of households in the US that have 2 or more cars. And you also have large sprawling suburbs where a lot of people will have access to home charging options. So China and Europe pull ahead, but the US catches up in the 2030s because we think a lot of those cars or a lot of those households can go electric quite quickly once the economics are a little bit better. So that's all about passenger cars. Another one of the findings this year was around other segments. And we think there are several killer apps emerging for electrification in the 2020s. So commercial vehicles, buses, and 2- and 3-wheelers. So you're really seeing those mostly being a China story, but also starting to spread outside of China. The fleet of those is growing really rapidly. There's already over 500,000 electric buses, over 240 million 2- and 3-wheelers, and the commercial delivery van segment is starting to take off as well. Now, I think it's safe to say that for buses and 2-wheelers, we've already crossed the tipping point. So they're about 20% of the fleet for 2-wheelers and 16% of the fleet for buses globally is already electric. So we're already past the tipping point, I would say. On delivery vans, I think you're going to see that in the next 2 or 3 years. What that market has mainly been waiting for is more options on the supply side. So we know there's demand from large corporate buyers, but there just hasn't been very compelling options. That's not going to last long. I think you're going to see that gap in the market closed by a combination of incumbents and established automakers, and you're going to see that market go really quickly in the next few years. So a few killer apps emerging. Another one is around overall passenger vehicle sales. So we actually think overall passenger vehicle sales peak now in 2036, and that internal combustion engine vehicle sales have already peaked. Now, calling peaks as analysts is really uncomfortable because you're more likely to get it wrong and to get looked back on when it's proved wrong as being silly. But we're gonna do it anyway. We think it's important to recognize that saying that vehicle sales grow forever is actually a controversial statement. So we think they peak, and it's not because demand for mobility goes down. We start with kilometers of mobility as our basic unit, and that's what we forecast with, and then we build a fleet and sales onto that. We think demand for mobility keeps going up as population goes up and GDP goes up. And you can see the big COVID dip there in 2020. But we think vehicle sales peak around the mid-2030s. And some people think this is really due to shared mobility. And certainly shared mobility plays a role. And that's what's on the right is highly autonomous vehicles we think come in, but not until the mid-2030s. And their impact is limited in emerging economies. And shared vehicles also play a role, so that's part of what's causing vehicle sales to peak. But the bigger one is actually a much more demographic driven argument. So the working age population in most large auto markets has already peaked, including China. So China's working age population peaked a few years ago and is now in decline. And also urbanization. So urbanization is rising still rapidly throughout the world. It's one of the few consistent trends throughout human history. The last 1,000 years, every year, more of us live in cities. And I don't think COVID will change that. And that means that we think that starts to have an impact on whether you can continue to grow vehicle sales forever. We don't think you can. We think it starts to peak around the mid-20s, or mid-2030s, I should say. And again, just to look at that chart on the right is electric internal combustion engine and fuel cell vehicles. So what that means is that sales of internal combustion engine vehicles probably peaked for the passenger vehicle segment in 2017. Maybe it's in 2017. We don't think they'll return to growth. We think by the time the recovery from COVID is in full swing, EVs will already be sort of 5 to 10%, and then it's very hard to see internal combustion engine vehicles returning to those highs of 2017 and 2018. But fuel cell vehicles do have an impact on some commercial segments in the 2030s. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we could go into a lot of work just on the cost of hydrogen and the outlook for hydrogen. We do think generating green hydrogen does get significantly more economic over the next 20 years, particularly in regions that are pursuing this heavily, parts of China, South Korea, Japan, California, and parts of Europe. So we do have a forecast for all the different commercial vehicle segments, light, medium, and heavy. Generally, we see these playing a role in the 2030s, not so much in the 2020s. The numbers are all still very small. So the fuel cell vehicle market is definitely going to grow. There's nowhere really to go but up. So we think that plays a role, but it's mostly constrained to the commercial vehicle segment. Adoption of new battery chemistries, we think, accelerates, and costs continue to drop. I won't spend too much time on this either. We've done a lot of work on battery costs over the years, and we have a team that just looks at energy storage technologies. We think there's lots of room still to run. There's lots of room for improvement and in cost decline and more cost declines. Every year we hear people say that the battery cost curve you guys have been plotting for the last 10 years, it's going to stall, it's going to bottom out. We don't think that's the case. We think it will continue to come down. We think there's a very clear runway to $100 a kilowatt hour. A lot below that, you do need some more fundamental advances, but there are lots of candidates for that as well. Another finding is that you need much more charging infrastructure, but that most of that is at home or at work. We don't think there's as much public charging infrastructure needed as many people say. Right now, there's about 1 million public charging connectors globally, more than half of that in China. By 2040, we think that's about 12 million. And really that's because we think a lot of the charging that gets done is still going to be done at home and at work. More of it, as you go over time, more of it starts to be done in public, but still the largest number of chargers and the largest amount of kilowatt hours dispensed is very much still at home and at workplace charging. Oil demand from passenger vehicles has already peaked in our forecast, which was also kind of another surprising conclusion and maybe a controversial one. If we look at the trajectory for passenger vehicle oil demand, we see a big dip in 2020, a relatively slow recovery. And then really by the time it gets going again, it rises for a little while, but then in the 2030s starts to drop. So we do think that fuel economy and efficiency play a big role in that, but electric vehicles also play a big role, and so does shared mobility. The impact on electricity is actually limited. It's really only a few percent additional electricity demand out in 2030, and then sort of 7 to 10 in these larger economies out in 2040. It's a bigger share in some smaller emerging economies, it's a smaller share in other emerging economies, but for these big economies, it's a relatively modest contribution to total electricity demand. Another interesting finding that we found from this is actually that this was the first time we've done all different segments of road transport. And when you look at the charging profiles for those and you stack them all up, what you find is that the charging load profile, the combined charging load profile of all these different electric vehicle segments is actually much flatter than if you just electrified one segment. And that's a really important conclusion because it means there are sort of non-linear benefits to electrifying more segments of road transport rather than just focusing on one. And it should make the process of integrating these into the grid easier. The way we sort of like to put it is that this is a feature, not a bug of a 21st century power and transport system. This idea that electric vehicles can absorb a lot of the excess and variable generation that's coming and also that this load profile can be flattened out a little bit more than when a few years ago when everyone was just looking at the passenger vehicle load profile and concluding that there would be some problems from that. So then the last one that I'll highlight is that despite all that, and if that seems like a very optimistic view, emissions are still not on track. So overall, road transport emissions are only in 2040 about back to where they were today. Electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles do reduce emissions pretty substantially, but because of this growth in the fleet, it means that you have to run to stand still to some degree. So if you want to see that go faster, there's probably two big things that you're going to have to see from governments around the world. One of them is more stringent regulations on heavy-duty trucks and more technology options coming out for heavy-duty trucks. That is a big part of the emissions growth and also the oil demand growth. So while passenger vehicle oil demand we think has peaked, overall oil demand keeps growing for over another 10 years, mostly driven by the commercial sector. So that is a really important part. And then the other thing that you're already seeing more governments doing is announcing phase-out targets for internal combustion engine vehicles. Now those, if we are going to bend the curve faster, those will probably have to be brought forward. And you are starting to see more governments doing that. So those are our 10 findings. I'll just leave you with one closing thought, and that's around opportunities in transformation. So when Bloomberg NEF was founded in 2004, this was one of the themes, essentially that there will be new winners and losers in this change to a low carbon economy. And so for the Nordics, I think there are some real opportunities as the market leaders around electrification. One of them is around charging infrastructure business models. Another one is around aggregation, grid integration, and forecasting tools for how we manage all these electrified vehicles on the grid. I also think there's a lot of opportunities around new mobility business models. So things like different structures for car rentals that allow you to say, I only need a car very infrequently, but I need a subscription for that that allows me to do it for 6 trips out on the weekends per year to supplement the fact that I have an EV for the time when I'm in the city. We're already starting to see that in Norway and other parts of the world. I think there's more opportunities there. Then, of course, around marine applications, big opportunities there, and I think the Nordics can be real leaders. And then lastly, of course, we may not know. There may be other things that surprise us, and I'm sure there will be other opportunities that come along. And there are real opportunities in this transformation and some real windows for the market leaders that have led on electrification to date. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And again, hopefully I'll be in Oslo again in person again sometime soon. But thanks for joining us for this, and good to speak to you all.
Thank you, Colin. That's extremely interesting findings and viewpoints, both from you and from Seb. I'm thinking, it's an optimistic view that you are presenting in terms of extremely fast-growing electric vehicle sales. But on the other hand, as you said in your last remark, this is nowhere fast enough to avoid serious climate change. And we need, it's a major task for all of us here to make this go even faster and prove Bloomberg New Energy Finance wrong. And one of the reflections I'm, having when listening to the presentation is that when electric vehicles become actually competitive and infrastructure is not a big barrier towards purchasing an electric vehicle, I'm thinking, if I was a government in any country, I would, what would stop governments from basically phasing out fossil fuel vehicles completely as electric vehicles are competitive? So the upsides here are, in terms of political influence, and putting in stronger incentives, I believe must be large. Before I follow up on Colin and Seb, I would like to ask Christian and Tina. Now, we've seen that Rystad Energy and also Bloomberg Energy Finance say that oil demand is about to peak. Rystad recently said that peak oil demand may have been in 2019. And we know that all civilized countries in the world will do everything in their power to crush the business model of fossil fuels by doing what we've been discussing here, incentivizing electric vehicle and transport. Does it feel like a paradox for you that we have just recently passed a major incentive package for oil and gas investments, while at the same time having a target of getting rid of oil and gas?
Well, I think these are two different things. And to the first thing that you mentioned, I think, and I say this often when I'm out at conferences or I speak on these issues, that what we've done in Norway is, by all means, a gigantic paradox. Because our policy on electric vehicles and all the money that we've spent in lost revenue supporting it and giving incentives to have this amazing growth on how many new vehicles are now electric being sold in Norway is a clear policy removing the need for our main export product, which is oil and gas. But it's right. It's the right thing to do. And we love to say in Norway, look to Norway for our solutions. But on this issue, I really do think we also now have the numbers to back it up, that this is something to look to Norway for. But we also have to keep in mind that, of course, this comes at a cost. And the dilemma is that when you're really starting to pick up speed on this and you're having good numbers, it starts to cost more as well for the government. When you've changed out your whole car park, basically, after a few years, then where's the tax going to come in on vehicles, because we're keeping the incentives? So there's that breaking point, but it shows that it works, and we need to do more of it. But when it comes to the package that you were mentioning on oil and gas, this is super important because this is our main technology industry and represents thousands of jobs. And it would be really strange, in my opinion, to not also lend a lending hand to this industry, as we've done with many other industries in this very, very extraordinary situation.
Christian, you have a past being an executive in the oil and gas industry as well, in the refinery business, but now you're in a 100% renewable company. Would you be comfortable investing your funds and your company's funds in fossil fuels from now?
I fundamentally believe that the winds of change in this industry will mainly come from the consumption, from the use of energy. What we heard today and is discussing now, namely the change into dominantly electric vehicles in the future, is such a trend. And that will, of course, bring demand down for fuel to cars and fuel to vans and buses and two-wheelers and so on. I don't think the change will come from lack of oil and gas or lack of coal, for that matter. So we need, at one hand, to go full speed, like Norway is doing, on changing that demand pattern. Norway is in the forefront of stating that by 2025, 5 years from now, it should not be allowed to buy a fossil new car in Norway. That is a shift in demand. If we look at the oil and gas, most oil fields, they have a decline rate that is of such a matter that we still need new oil supply in the world to replace the old oil fields. So I think it is possible to have a profitable oil and gas business for many years as well. On behalf of this planet, I hope that the whole development will speed up and go faster than what is predicted by Bloomberg. So Bloomberg will not be wrong. They will be right, but earlier than predicted, I think.
If we could
even in that case, we need oil and gas for a substantial amount of time. So we need it. It's like when the whole car fleet in the world went from coal to oil. That happened because there was a switch of fuel in the ships. It was not because it was a lack of coal. And the same thing will happen from oil and gas to renewables, and it will take time. So yes, we need both for quite some time. For the climate, the most important is the speed of the transition.
Maybe talking a bit about the Nordic opportunities that Colin mentioned at the end of his presentation. Could you have some reflective remarks, Christian, from the point of view of being large now in EV charging yourself as Statkraft, but also from Kari Elisabeth, some reflections on what you see as the opportunities going forward?
Yes, so Statkraft is now operating the second largest electric vehicle charging system in Norway. It is called Grønn Kontakt. And we also have charging operations in Sweden and the UK and Germany. So we are among the fast movers in electric vehicles charging. And what we see is exactly what was illustrated here, that charging is increasing all the time. So it is a business in itself. But also the combined need, even if the amount of energy is small, 7 to 10% extra electricity needed in a normal European country to fuel or to drive the car fleet in the future. That is a small number, but if we look on the megawatts, on how much instant capacity is needed to charge all these cars, that is massive. So to control the integrated system here is also a business of its own in the future, to integrate the flexible and the non-flexible demand in a combined way. So there we see business models as well, which was also mentioned as an interesting idea. And I also believe that new models for car sharing or use IT in an advanced way for mobility in the future can have business models that we have not yet exploited. So I agree to all those options, yes.
Yeah, Karl-Elisabeth, are you comfortable with what was recently passed? I mean, shouldn't we rather look for business opportunities for Norway within the market that we have created in electrification of the transport sector?
Yes, we should. And just a comment first on the market for the oil and gas industry in the future, because it's not a question about whether or not there's going to be oil and gas in the future in Norway. There are going to be oil and gas production in the future in Norway. We have fields in production at the moment that are scheduled to be producing oil and gas for many decades to come. It's more a question on what should we do now for the decade that we're entering at the moment, and should we really be planning for and also in a way subsidizing for starting up new oil production and new oil fields in the Barents Sea that are, I would say it's more a question if it's going to be profitable for the Norwegian society in the future. So, and I've been negotiating the various crisis and stimulus packages in the parliament for the past months, and we need to keep in mind that Norway have a lot of money, basically, and perhaps too much money as well. We were ready to use 80 billion Norwegian kroner for just saving existing businesses, and that's the stimulus package from the oil and gas for the oil and gas industry kept outside. So we have a lot of money basically, and the question now is what we're going to spend it on. And we've been adopting these packages without having one single demand for example, sustainability or climate, which is a stark contrast to what's been happening in the EU, where you have said that 25% of the crisis packages and the money being spent there needs to have a climate perspective and be used for reducing climate gas emissions, and also need to have the sustainability all along. So we're sort of, I fear in a way that we're spending a lot of money now without really take a look at the climate goals that we have set for 2030. And
to bring in our experts from London, as I said, it's politicians' job to make your assumptions or your predictions wrong and grow the electrification even faster. And do you see any possible game changers in politics as technology develops further and costs go down? Do you see any potential game changers from large cities, from countries, from the EU, both in terms of crisis packages, but also in sort of climate policy in general? Colin, you may comment on that.
Yeah, I can start with that. I think we definitely acknowledge that policy is still something that can dramatically change this curve, right? And I mentioned that even just seeing the stimulus packages announced for France and Germany and the one that's coming for the EU level, that will probably drive our European forecast up. And similarly, if there's a change in the federal government in the US in November, then we will probably see tighter fuel economy regulations in the US too, and that will drive those numbers up. So policy is always kind of an accelerant. I think the challenge is that it can be a decelerant too. And what I think the real challenge is getting the mix just right. In an ideal world, you support something right up to the point of organic takeoff, and then the market takes over and it grows on its own. And just from watching this stuff for 15 years around clean energy and clean transport, that's almost never the way it works. There's always sort of cliff edges. You pull some demand forward. You have to change a subsidy because it's getting too expensive. So there's a big drop off in the following year. I think one of the biggest challenges will be just to get okay with that, to accept that there is going to be some bumps and some changes, but that if you do really want to hit climate targets, you are going to significantly have to get fossil fuels out of road transport. And that is not easy. I mean, when we do our forecast, it feels quite aggressive, the numbers we're talking about. But as you see, when you go to the emission side, they're nowhere near aggressive enough to hit those targets. So one of the things we are watching very closely is whether more countries put legal backing to these phase-out targets that they have announced. So many governments have stated them. We've got, I think, tracking 14 different countries that have set targets for either 2030 or 2040 generally. Most of them don't have strong legal backing yet, but they're starting to get those. So that's one of the things we're keeping an eye on really closely, because we don't assume any of those are hit. We haven't assumed that the Norwegian target, it's a small auto market, but that is hit. We haven't assumed the UK one is hit, the French one is hit, because in those cases, we're not confident enough that there are legislative measures that are going to punish somebody if they're not hit. So I think that's something we're watching very closely, is how hard, especially after this crisis, do governments lean in? Are governments going to lean in on this crisis to try and accelerate what we've been seeing to date? And I think in places like Europe and China, there's pretty good odds that there are. But we need to wait a little bit and see exactly what those measures are going to look like across the board.
At least if I was a mayor in a major city, I think I would try to keep that clean air that we've been seeing lately.
That we saw in the picture of Colin in London as well.
Maybe we should introduce...
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to ask Tina Bru a question as well. I was just thinking, we were talking about now about the stimulus measures, but I just wanted to ask you, do you believe that electrification per se can become not only a measure to cut emissions, but a measure to stimulate innovation and also job creation in Norway? And maybe we can play that a bit further into the international arena as well. But your reflections on that?
Well, the short answer is yes, definitely. And I mean...
And how do we do that?
Well, I think we already have proved that we can do that in Norway. I mean, electrification is basically the backbone for a lot of our industry, and we're seeing great opportunity in more industry based on clean power that we have here in Norway. So there are many different things that you can do. I see great opportunities. But this all plays into the whole picture about what other countries are going to do as well, because there really is no point in electrifying your community or your businesses or your industry if your power generation isn't clean. So it all kind of hangs together with the fact that you produce more renewable energy and that you have... We're lucky, we have lots of hydropower. We're also building onshore wind. We're looking at offshore wind. So that kind of needs to be the backbone, because there really is no reason to push that as a job creator or something for innovation if it's not clean. That's the baseline.
I believe, Kari Elisabeth, you had some reflective remarks, and Christian as well. But please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I mean, there's no doubt there's going to be a lot of jobs if we do the right thing at the moment where we stand now. And I think that what we've seen with the oil and gas industry over the past days shows us how much this transition is needed for the Norwegian economy as well. It's going to be difficult, and we need to create a lot of new jobs. And that's why I think it's important that we now take a step back and really see that we don't really have the measures in place to create all those jobs at the moment. We're not taking the right decisions. We need to do a lot more. We're not on track to reach the target for 2025 for electric vehicles. We're not at the track on the moment to really be in front for offshore wind globally and to grow business here in Norway. So we need to do a lot more for the coming years if we're going to be able to sort of take a global leading role in these areas. And I think that's necessary if we're going to create enough jobs.
Now, Mira, I think we're getting lots of questions from the audience. Maybe we should introduce.
Yeah, I think we have a bit more time. We can move over to that. But maybe Christian, you wanted to. Yeah, I saw you had your hand up as well, so you wanted to say something.
Comments on two issues here. First, we believe in Statkraft, based also on analysis that the global electricity supply will be dominantly renewable. Our forecast is 80% renewable by mid-century. So, but we don't have time to wait until that has happened and then electrify. We need to do it in parallel. So, of course, the first year of electrification, it is still quite a high share of fossil into the mix, but that drops every year. So even by 2040 and certainly by 2050, there will be a combination of a very high renewable share in electricity and a high electrification, of which electric vehicles is an eminent example. But it's not only there, it is in industry, buildings, and all parts of society. And that is the main route to the world to get CO2 emissions down, because 3/4 of all CO2 emissions on the planet is from burning of fossil fuels. So this is really important, and the business opportunities coming out of this will be huge. That is as when the combustion engine was invented, or airplanes was invented, or mobile phones. There will be a lot.
Maybe we should take one question
Yes,
from our audience as well.
We are getting questions from around the world, actually, and I think I would like to pass a question from Simon in London. What role does Norway see itself playing in scaling EV production, and in particularly battery production, to meet increased demand? And we know there are battery production projects now seeking capital. Would we like to see that happening, Tina?
Perfect. Yes, welcome.
And what will you do to make that happen?
Well, I think we already have a lot of the incentives in place. I mean, we have clean energy. It's pretty cheap. So if you are looking for somewhere to invest, somewhere to build industry and produce batteries, where better than Norway?
But no stimulus packages for that. That's only for oil and gas investments.
Well, no, I don't want the state to build batteries. I want private investors to come here and see opportunity and to do that. I think they'll do it better than we could do as well. But for the political framework, it's important to have the incentives. And then I think making sure you have a good grid, that it's strong, it's efficient, it works for demand, that the energy is there, that there's plenty of it, and that it's cheap, should be really good incentives to come to Norway and invest.
Would you like to invest in that?
If anyone listening in here wants to establish a factory for electric batteries in Norway, or any other green new industry, we can offer from Statkraft a very favorable contract for the next 20 years of cheap electricity.
Exactly.
Thank you, Christian. Also a question actually from the audience, and maybe to include Seb and Colin from London again. What do you see the role of hydrogen going forward, both in transport and in the industry sector at large? Maybe Seb, you can reflect a bit on that.
Sure. I hope my audio is better now. If it's not, someone wave at me and I'll pass to Colin. Hydrogen has a lot of potential. It's an incredible opportunity for the hard-to-abate sectors, of course, which represent a significant fraction of global emissions. The real challenge is scale. And at the moment, electrolysis is very expensive for Western-made devices, and there's a journey to get the cost down. We think, though, that that's possible. That's only possible with subsidies and a lot of intent to make hydrogen sort of the clean molecule that supports the electrification of transport industry, heat, etc., to get to those net zero targets. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think that the focus thus far has been historically too much on fuel cell vehicles. And I think Colin will be the first to say that it's a tiny fraction of the low carbon vehicles that we're seeing being sold today. And we think will be sold in the future. The real focus needs to be on industry and setting targets that drive industry to find innovative solutions to their carbon emissions is the first step, I think, to incentivizing the development of a hydrogen economy. But it's a long way to go before that's a cost competitive way to reduce emissions from where we are today.
Thank you, Seb.
Follow up on that, maybe.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Christian, we're both driving electric cars, and we will probably not see ourselves driving anything else anytime. But on the other hand, large ships, vessels, possibly aircrafts, may not be able to run on batteries. How do you go about to make hydrogen part of your business?
My belief here is that batteries will continue to develop. They will continue to go down in cost. So the passenger cars and also into vans and two-wheelers and even buses will be fully battery electric. But for the long-distance traveling, that is long-distance shipping, airlines and very heavy trucking over long distances, we need more than batteries. And then the hydrogen will play an important role. It could either be as hydrogen as a gas, compressed or liquefied, or it could be hydrogen converted into a liquid called ammonia, which is in combination with nitrogen. And so what we should and could do in Norway, but also in other countries, is to speed up development of the technology around the use of hydrogen and the use of ammonia. In Norway, where we can take a leading role is probably in shipping, because we are a shipping nation. We are constructing a lot of ships. Today, a lot of offshore ship vessels, but we can make all sorts. Yes, we can be a test lab for utilizing trucks, but we don't produce any trucks. We don't produce any windmills either. But what we do, we produce a lot of ships. So there, I think we have a major possibility in Norway, not only to be an example for the rest of the world, but to really develop a new industry.
I actually have a question for here. Thank you so much, Christian. From a journalist, I believe, based in Denmark, if I'm not mistaken. The journalist is asking that the power usage in Norway will rise to 157 terawatts in 2035. How will Norway meet the rising demand for electricity? Maybe as sort of one of the concluding questions here. How do we tackle that?
As of today, we have a huge surplus, and if we see Norway and Sweden combined, we have almost 50 terawatt hours of surplus electricity. So the problem is not to get enough electricity, it is to put it into a good use. But in the long run, there will be a need for more electricity also in Norway, and we have a huge wind resources that can be utilized in a good way, where the government will make regulations for that, onshore and offshore. Plus, the hydro system in Norway can be expanded, especially with more megawatts, so we can regulate faster, and thereby we can take on more solar, more wind, and also more imports, and balance it out with our strong hydro system. So Norway and other countries with a strong hydro system are the best places to expand even further. So I can see no problem with more renewable electricity in the future for the development.
Thank you so much to everyone here in the audience. The hour has actually gone extremely quickly. You can see when there's a heated debate, time flies. Thank you so much for all our panelists and speakers here, and Seb and Colin, you in London. For everybody in the audience, you can actually download Colin's presentation on our website. There will also be the executive summary of the electric vehicle outlook and a recorded viewership of this webinar. So thank you very much from all of us.